Lord Jesus, thank you for the gift of this beautiful day. Thank you for the gift of our faith. Thank you for everything that everyone has already shared here in this encounter with you. And we ask you also, Jesus, to open our hearts and our minds. Help us to see the beauty of your plan for the human person, to believe it with all of our hearts, and to live it with courage. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Christ our King.
Thy kingdom come.
Mary, Queen of Apostles.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
All right, so good morning. Can you see the screen here? Am I blocking the screen for anybody? Great. So today we continue with our series, it's Created for Love series, and today we're going to talk about the resurrection of the body, gender, and our Catholic faith. So I think as we start, it's just important to remember quickly the vision for the RC women's section here. Just to always have that fresh, loving and living like Christ, burning desire to be a passionate apostle, and looking to the Blessed Mother for her intercession. And then these questions are always relevant. Did we work like Jesus? Did we reveal Christ's love, form apostles, send them out, awaken the individual and the family to their mission in life and in the church? And also, I've begun each of the talks with this quote from Pope Paul VI, now St. Paul VI, about dialogue, which I think is so important. Before speaking, we must take great care to listen not only to what people say, but more especially to what they have it in their hearts to say. Only then will we understand them and respect them, and even as far as possible, agree with them. And then just another quick reminder of our goals here with each of these talks. First of all, to explain what Christ teaches us through the church. So just to have that clear. Then explain why Christ teaches us that. To try to connect the dots for us, is what that means. And then to bring it all to prayer, and then finally to be able to explain it to others with courage and with love. And as we said, I think the last time, it's never us and them, it's always us. Whenever we're talking about any of these things, it's not us and them, it's always us. And here's a beautiful quote from Jeremiah. God saying to each person, I've loved you with an everlasting love, and so I have continued my faithfulness to you. And I think it's so important to remember that, especially when we're talking about these situations that are, humanly speaking, very difficult. And there's no easy solution to them. It's so important to remember that God doesn't just say this to the chosen few, that this is to every person. He's continued his faithfulness to every person. Okay, so this particular talk is an interesting talk because in one sense it could be the shortest of all the talks. Because, we could just say boys are boys and girls are girls. Right? Really, it's that obvious. It's common sense. There is something called gender dysphoria, which we'll talk about later, which is a psychological condition where a man doesn't feel like he's a man, or a woman doesn't feel like she's a woman, or doesn't feel at home in his or her body. But it's a psychological condition. The reality is that boys are boys, girls are girls. It's pretty basic. So we could just say that and we could all eat donuts and go home. But what I want to talk about today is just quickly, what are some of the causes of why we are where we are today? Where we have a situation where people are denying something that is the most obvious reality in the universe. Where did we come from? How are we at this point now? So the causes. Secondly, to go a little bit deeper into what the Catholic Church teaches about the human body, actually. Because it is true that it's simple. Boys are boys, girls are girls. But there's actually a whole beautiful theology behind all of this that I think is important to go into. And then look at gender dysphoria. That's important too. Just understand that a little bit because it is a real psychological condition. And then finally, what can we do? And again, as with all these topics, it's really important to approach this with a lot of reverence because we're not talking about numbers or statistics. We're talking about human beings and people who really do suffer tremendously from this. So we're really walking on holy ground here. And I think it's also important to remember number 1 of the Catechism, where it says that God has created us to share in his plan of love. We're all created for that. We're all created for love. And part of being created for love and out of love means being created as a man or woman. I was talking to this guy a couple of weeks ago, this young guy that I see for spiritual direction, and he was talking about this whole gender mayhem, and he said, I really think that actually this transgender movement that we're seeing now is kind of like the ultimate rejection of the gift of creation. I said, yeah, that's exactly what it is. Rejection of the gift of creation. And no society in human history has ever questioned the most obvious reality. We're created as men and women. So what's happened today that all of a sudden we're questioning it? So I think that there are three forces that have converged. So first one is Gnosticism. I'm not trying to blame Star Wars here, actually, it's not Star Wars' fault. But there's something really important here about Gnosticism. So Gnosticism is a philosophical system that actually goes back to the very early years of the Catholic Church. St. Irenaeus of Lyon, who was a bishop in France in the 2nd century, wrote a work called Against the Heresies, which was actually against this philosophical idea of Gnosticism. So basically, it believes in a dual universe. That's why I put Star Wars up here. A dual universe in which there is a good force and an evil force. And they're equally powerful, and they're fighting against each other all the time. So it's a dual universe, principle of good, principle of evil, equally powerful, in constant conflict with each other. Matter, like the human body, is seen as evil. So the material world is evil, the spirit is good. So this good force is epitomized by the spirit, the evil force is epitomized by matter, and by especially the human body. So you can imagine it like this. Gnosticism would say that we have a spirit, each person has a spirit, that spirit is like a little spark of the divine that's trapped within the evil matter of the human body. Salvation is for that spark of the divine to become free from the human body and to become itself, to become divine. So that's why we call it dualism, because there's this strong antithesis between the material world and the spiritual world. So they would see a human person as a body which has trapped this spirit inside of it, and the spirit is trying to get out. And that's where salvation comes from. And this has reappeared throughout history, too. It's not just something that's confined to 2,000 years ago. In fact, the Dominican order was started in the 1200s to fight against a recurrence of this heresy, which is called Albigensianism in France. But it was the same thing. It was just matter is bad, spirit is good. The spirit's trying to escape from matter. So I think that's the first force that we see now. There's a neo-Gnosticism, which is very real. I'm me, and then there's this body. But the real me isn't my body. The real me is something else that's trying to escape from this body. And that takes a million different permutations, but I think that's the essence of it, is Gnosticism. That's the first force. Second force is relativism. Do you remember our friend William of Ockham that we spoke about in the first talk on relativism, this Franciscan friar back in the 1300s, who said that we can't know the essence of anything. So we can't know what a tree is, what a table is, what a man is, what a woman is. We can't know the essence of anything. We just give names to things, but we don't really know what something is or what someone is. And then he said that freedom is the ability to choose whatever I want. So it's absolute will. That's what matters. I can choose whatever I want, wherever I want, whenever I want. It's a total freedom from any restraint. So you put those two things together, we can't know what anything is, and I'm free to choose whatever I want. We get relativism, modern relativism. And relativism plays a big part as well in this whole transgender movement that we see here. I think the third force, which is converging with the other two, is the technological revolution that we have, because we have an amazing technological capacity, a scientific capacity to do incredible things. But the problem is that there's often a belief that if we can do something, we should do it. If we can do it, we should do it. That's sort of the mentality. And so if you put all these three things together, this Gnosticism, my true self is trying to escape from the body, relativism, you can't really know what it is to be a man or a woman anyway, and I can choose whatever I want, and the technological revolution, I think we get where we are today. And here again, we're not here to judge people who experience what we call gender dysphoria, which means men who don't feel at home in their bodies or women who don't feel at home in their bodies. People really do experience that, and they suffer tremendously from that. We'll talk about that later. But right now, we're just looking at the cultural process for how we got to where we are today. The next point here is that we are our bodies. And I know this is going to sound shocking even for some Catholics, because we've all kind of grown up in a dualistic mentality for a long time, for hundreds of years, where we can even tend to think of ourselves as like a soul that inhabits a body, and then at some point my soul's going to be freed from the body. But that's actually not what the Catholic Church teaches. So the Apostles' Creed is the oldest formulation of the Catholic faith. It goes back to the Apostles. And the Apostles' Creed, we know, ends with, I believe, in the resurrection of the body and life everlasting. So this is from the Catechism, number 990. The resurrection of the flesh, the literal formulation of the Apostles' Creed, means not only that the immortal soul will live on after death, but that even our mortal body will come to life again. So the church doesn't teach that we're just this spirit inhabiting a body for a certain amount of time and then we die and the spirit's freed to soar on high. It teaches that actually we are body and soul. Body and soul are inseparable. That's why death is so terrible. It's a separation of something that in God's plan is one, the human person, body and soul. And so we believe that at the end of time, there will be a resurrection of the body too. So we'll still be us in heaven. That's part of the gift. So I'll still be me, you'll still be you. We don't know exactly what that's like. That's a mystery. St. Paul says we'll have a spiritual body. And we can talk about that later in the Q&A if people have more questions, because it's an interesting topic. It's not going to be exactly like it is now, but it will still be us. So I'm really hoping I'll be able to dunk a basketball in heaven, but we'll still be us. It's part of the gift, actually, and we'll still be men and women for all eternity. So we are our bodies. And I wanted to give just 4 quick reasons why the human body as male and female is so important to our faith as Catholics. So, first reason, we reflect the Blessed Trinity. So these are 2 pictures of, well, I think everybody knows who these 2 people are. But it's really interesting if you read St. John Paul II's second encyclical called Rich in Mercy that he wrote in 1980. It's about divine mercy, about God's mercy. But in that, he has the longest footnote I've ever seen in any written work. It's like the mother of all footnotes. It's 1 line in the page, and the rest of the page is a footnote. It's this enormous footnote about 2 words in Hebrew. But it's really beautiful, actually. Footnote number 52, if you're interested in reading the longest footnote in history. But he says that in Hebrew, there are 2 words that describe God's love. One is the word hesed, which you see up here, H-E-S-E-D. And the other one is the word rachamim, which is up here as well. And he said, in a certain sense, these 2 words describe masculine and feminine characteristics of God's love. Now here we need to be really careful. God doesn't have a body, right? The Blessed Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in themselves don't have a body. They're not male or female. Jesus, the Son, has a body now for all eternity, but God is not male or female, so it's an analogy. And in every analogy, there's something that's similar and something that's different. But John Paul II says there is a real analogy here. And he said the first word, hesed, means God's steadfast, stable love that's faithful to itself. That God is faithful to himself. So he's steadfast, he's stable, he's faithful. It's a certain strength in his love. And John Paul II said, in a certain sense, you could say that's kind of what we would experience as a masculine characteristic of God. And then he said the other word that Hebrew uses is rachamim. And that actually comes from the Hebrew word for womb. It means a woman's womb. And he said that shows the tenderness of God's love, the capacity of God's love to welcome another person, the capacity of God for this compassion and sensitivity. And he said, in a certain sense, that could be the feminine characteristic of God, a reflection of that in God. So I just love these two pictures here because I thought they showed that beautifully. The first one, St. John Paul II in Rio de Janeiro, when he went there in 1980 or 81, I think it was one of his first apostolic trips. And he was in a favela. So the favelas in Brazil are some of the worst slums in the world. They're horrible. They're so dangerous the police won't even go near them. But he was actually in one of them, and they had this whole procession there in the streets. And all of a sudden, this little girl, and I think they have her name, but they don't know much else about her. She kind of disappeared from history after this point, but she managed to get past the Swiss guards, and she was just sobbing uncontrollably. And so she ran over to him, and he just hugged her. He said some things, so nobody knows what he said to her. And she finally calmed down, and they continued. But just the look of strength on his face was something that really impressed me. Just the kind of steadfastness that's there. And then the second is Mother Teresa with one of the babies that they had saved in Calcutta. So I just thought they were kind of neat manifestations of that has said in that Rachamim. So that's the first reason. We reflect the Blessed Trinity as men and women. That's not something we decide. That's something that God gives. And it's not to say that men aren't also called to be sensitive and tender, women aren't called to be steadfast, but there are certain characteristics that stand out more in men and women. That's part of God's gift, and it's reflecting something that's in God. The second reason that the body is so important is that the second person of the Blessed Trinity has a body forever. Jesus has a body forever. This is Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew here in Rome. So our bodies now, the human body, is part of the inner life of the Blessed Trinity, part of the love of God in a very profound way. Third reason that our bodies are so important and that we are our bodies forever is we can only know and love in the body. After World War II, in England, I think in France, Germany, Russia, a lot of the countries that had lost a lot of people due to bombings, you had many orphans. And so in some countries, at least in England, they were trying to take care of the orphans. So they had orphanages, and they had all these babies who were orphans. And they found something really strange, that even though the babies were being fed and taken care of materially, a lot of them started to die. And they couldn't figure out why. Why are they all dying? Because they have enough to eat, they're being taken care of. And some psychologists said, well, why don't you just try having some of the nurses hold them? Just for 10 minutes. It doesn't matter if they're related to them, just have a nurse hold them for 10 minutes a day. And then they found after that the problem was solved. The baby started flourishing. So they call this failure to thrive in little kids. But so much of it's dependent on touch, actually. And then as we get older, through what we see, what we hear, the body is that important because our bodies express the person. St. John Paul II would say that our bodies express the person. He'd actually say the bodies are the sacrament of the person, the visible sign of the person. Then finally, we are our bodies forever. Men or women, boys or girls, forever. I mean, for all eternity. And we are our bodies. It's not that we have a body. Sometimes we can think that we have a body, like we have a car, and you can switch cars from one car to another. But our body isn't a car with the spirit as the driver. That's a bad analogy. It's not a Catholic vision. We are our bodies. God created us men and women, and God doesn't make mistakes either. And how do we know if we're men or women? We know by our bodies. So it's not just by pink or blue. Those are social stereotypes. But we know by our bodies. And this is important. I remember hearing this, I can't remember who said this, but I thought it was a great point, that you often hear people say, I always felt, hear guys say, I always felt like I was a woman. That was, for example, Bruce Jenner. That was his big thing, and many others say, I always felt like I was a woman. Or you hear women, I always felt like I was a man. But it leads you to ask, how do you know what it feels like to be a woman? Or how do you know what it feels like to be a man? I don't know what it feels like to be a woman. I've never been a woman. I have no idea what it feels like. You can intuit certain things, but I don't know. You don't know what it feels like to be a man. So it's a little bit strange to hear people saying that. I know what it feels like to be a woman, or I know what it feels like to be. Actually, no, you don't. What happens is somebody might not feel at home in his body, but that's a different problem. It doesn't mean that he feels like he's a woman, because he has no idea what it feels like to be a woman. And so, there are boys who maybe like pink. Does that mean that they're girls? No, not at all. I have a cousin. When she was a little girl, when we were kids, she loved combat boots and fatigues, and she beat my brothers up. And now she's in her 30s, completely happy with being a woman, steady boyfriend, just a normal person. She grew out of it. Was she a boy because she liked combat boots and fatigues? No. Or if a boy likes to, write poetry and play the flute, does that mean he's a girl? No, not at all. So we have to be careful with these social stereotypes too. And to jump from that to say, okay, well, it means that I've always felt like I was a woman or felt like I was a man. We really don't know what that feels like. How do we know if we're male or female? Not by the way we feel, not by the colors that we like, by our bodies. That's how we know. So one last thing here that's important. For all eternity, as I mentioned, we will be our bodies. Because think of the two human bodies that are in heaven right now, Jesus and Mary. They're still very much Jesus and Mary. They're not some amorphous, transgender. They're actually man and woman. Actually, I remember this priest saying that his mom gave him a book once that she had gotten at a funeral. It was one of these books that talks about what it'll be like in heaven. He said, in heaven there won't be any more laughing or crying. It'll just be all happiness all the time, one steady state of happiness. And in heaven, we won't be men or women anymore. And so she said, how'd you like the book? And he said, well, actually, it's heresy. And she said, no, but I thought it was cute. He said, well, maybe it was cute, but he said, this is heresy, because in heaven we're going to be men or women for all eternity. So let's take a quick look now at gender dysphoria. So basically, gender dysphoria means we don't feel identified with our gender as it's expressed in our bodies. A person can feel trapped in his or her body. And I'm not trying to belittle this experience at all, because it is real. Some people, not many, but some people really do experience this. And it causes tremendous suffering for them. But just because we feel something or think something does not mean that it's true. Because have you ever felt anything that wasn't true before? I have. Have you ever thought anything that wasn't true?
Yeah.
I have. And sometimes it can be pretty intense, but it doesn't make it true. So when our thoughts and our feelings don't line up with reality, it doesn't mean that we should try to change reality. And when our thoughts and our feelings don't line up with the body that God's given us, it doesn't mean that we should try to change our body. Because imagine if we tried to apply that same logic to other things. Like, say, schizophrenia. For example, it's a terrible illness. People suffer from it so much. And they're united to Christ's cross in a deep way. But that doesn't mean that a doctor would ever dream of encouraging them to follow whatever those thoughts or those voices are telling them. No doctor would ever say, go and follow that. Or take scrupulosity. It's another example. It's a terrible suffering. It's hard for people. But sometimes people worry about things that don't have a basis in reality. I remember this guy who was convinced that if he missed one Hail Mary when he was praying the rosary, he would go to hell. It was tragic, he was really convinced of this, so he prayed the rosary hundreds of times every day, and then he'd get to the 5th decade and go back because he wasn't sure if he had prayed that one Hail Mary in the 1st decade. It was really tragic, and he really believed this. It wasn't like he was making this up, he really believed it. But would it have been merciful and right for me to encourage him in that? To say, yeah, you're probably right, you should go back and pray this hundreds of times because you might go to hell. No, I mean, I had to listen to him, try to understand where he was coming from, but I had to encourage him not to listen to that because his voices, his thoughts, his feelings didn't match up with reality. And in the same way, we are who we are. We're either male or female, down to the chromosomes in our body, and we can't change that. So here's an example that might help too, the second one. Body integrity identity disorder. This is a very rare psychological condition where people feel like they shouldn't have one of their limbs. So I saw a video the other day of a guy over in Edinburgh, Scotland, who's a healthy guy, 35 years old, normal, but he feels like he shouldn't have his right leg. He said, I've always felt like my right leg should have been amputated at the knee. And so every day he actually ties his leg up behind his thigh, and he just walks around with crutches to try to imagine that he has an amputated leg. Why? Because no doctor in the world will amputate his leg. The doctor's like, well, I mean, it's a perfectly healthy leg. We're not going to amputate it because it's perfectly healthy. But he really believes that he shouldn't have that leg. He believes that he's called, he's created, or whatever, to be an amputee. So his perception doesn't match up with reality. But the doctor doesn't say, well, try to change reality in order to match your perception. They say, well, let's try to work with this, with the psychiatrist to see how we can help your perception to match reality, not vice versa. And then finally here, number 3, Dr. Paul McHugh. So this is a fascinating study that Dr. Paul McHugh from Johns Hopkins and Dr. Lawrence Mayers did a couple of years ago about, it's very wide-ranging. It's about homosexuality, transgender. But he's interesting because he was actually one of the pioneers in gender reassignment surgery back in the 1970s at Johns Hopkins. But he said after a while, he started to notice a couple of things. People weren't getting better. They had the gender reassignment, they weren't getting better. And he said over 40% of them committed suicide. And he said if we were doing any other kind of treatment that had a higher than 40% mortality rate, we'd stop and say, whoa, wait a second, something is not right here. So he stopped doing it, started doing a lot more research, and in 2016 published a massive report about his findings. And a couple of things that I wanted to point out here that he said. This is from the chief of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins from 1975 till 2001, so it's a pretty serious academic. He said, the duty of all doctors who propose a treatment is to know the nature of the problem they propose to treat. It's pretty common sense, right? If we're going to try to cure something, we should know what the problem is first. And he said, the issue of transgender people is that the vast majority coming for surgery now don't have a biological reason, but a psychosocial reason for coming. It's not that there's a biological problem, there's a psychosocial problem. And he said, I want these people to get the help that they need, but the help should be psychiatric instead of surgical. And then he said, some patients may experience temporary satisfaction with this gender reassignment. But he said producing a satisfied or temporarily satisfied but still troubled patient seemed an inadequate reason for amputating normal organs, or for trying to change the composition of the body, or for pumping hormones into a person. So what can we do about all this? First of all, as always, prayer. We have this line from the book of Esther. When Esther was in that tough situation, when her uncle Mordecai asked her to go and speak with the king of Persia so that all the Jews wouldn't be slaughtered. And she didn't want to do it because she said, if I go in without being invited, one of two things will happen. Either he could extend the scepter to me and let me speak, or he could have me decapitated, and I don't want to die, so I don't really want to do this. And her uncle said, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So we're all born for this moment. God doesn't make mistakes. He wants us to be alive now. And he wants us to pray. To pray believing in the power of prayer. And secondly, listen. It's important to listen to others, ask questions. Jesus is always doing this in the gospel. John chapter 1, Jesus sees Peter and Andrew, and he says to them, what are you looking for? He's always asking questions. So just to listen in that dialogue to others. 3, be convinced of the truth in love. St. Edith Stein here with her quote, never accept something as truth if it lacks love, and never accept something as love if it lacks truth. And then courage here. This is from Joshua chapter 1, when Moses has just died and God tells Joshua, you're going to have to lead the people of Israel into the promised land. And you're going to have to fight the tribes that are there and keep them together. And God says to Joshua, I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and of good courage. Be not frightened or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And then, as I mentioned before, just reverence for each person. Remember the book of Isaiah when God says, you're precious in my eyes and glorious, and I love you. So reverence for every person. I know a priest up in New York, there's a legionary up there, who does street missions at Old St. Pat's in Soho. And Soho, for those of you who have been there in New York, is kind of a crazy district. It's the artistic district. You have everything up there, and you see absolutely everything imaginable. And so he has lay people up there with him, and then he'll have seminarians who'll come down from our seminary in Connecticut. And they just go out in the streets, they meet people, they invite them to come in for confessions. And then at the end, they always have this open pizza dinner in the basement there of the church. Anybody can come off the street. And so he said a couple of the seminarians came over to him, and they said, hey, Father, there's this woman over here who needs to talk to a priest. And he said, okay, so he goes over, and he said he got there, and he realized, that's not a woman. But the guy started talking to him and he said, who are you people? He didn't even know what a priest, he didn't know they were Catholic, he didn't know anything about it, but he had just seen free pizza, so he came in. And he said, who are you people? And the priest said, well, we're Catholic missionaries, there's some are priests, some are seminarians, some are lay people. He explained what all that meant. And this guy said, I have never felt so loved in my life. And he said, as soon as I came in, people, they said hi to me, and they gave me pizza, and they sat down and they talked to me, and they were always refilling my soda when I ran out, and now I've been drinking way too much Coke, but he said, it's great. But he said, who are you? And so that started a whole conversation, as you can imagine, for hours after that. But it was just that first experience of being loved as a person that helped that encounter. So a few resources. There's always fun. Mike Schmitz has a great 7-minute video about this if you're interested in something quick on YouTube. He's got a really, really good video that he did after Bruce Jenner, after that came out, I think it was 2015, after that whole media fanfare, which is very good. The second one's interesting, Christina Meade. It's a girl who works for Life Team, but it's really interesting because she's writing kind of this open letter to people who struggle with gender dysphoria from a Catholic point of view. So it's very good because it's very compassionate and welcoming at the same time, trying to explain why we believe what we believe as Catholics. Then Ryan Anderson, When Harry Became Sally, responding to the transgender moment. So this is interesting. This is a little more academic, a little more philosophical, explaining how we got to where we are today. But it's very well done. It's well written. And he calls it the transgender moment, which is interesting because he said it's something that just kind of came out of the blue, apparently. It did. We did have a lot of philosophical beginnings, but it's just a fad. It's really a fad now. And so he calls it this moment. Then we have this. So Dr. Paul McHugh and Lawrence Mayer, Sexuality and Gender. So if you have some time and would like to read 300 pages, it's really good. It's really, really good, but it is dense. It's very dense and it's very academic and scientific. But there is a summary of it, which I put here too. The National Catholic Register did a very good summary with a link to the study itself, which I put up here. So that might be a little bit more accessible. And who should I send this to? Who can send it to everybody else? Would that be Helen? Steph? Okay, well she's gone for another week, right? Can I send it to you, Helen? Is that okay?
Kareen. I don't have the
Kareen?
list.
Okay, I'll send it to Kareen. So that way you don't have to worry about writing all this down. You can just check out these resources. So the questions here that I would propose just for further reflection. Why does gender matter? I gave those 4 reasons that I thought are important why gender matters. But there might be others that come up with too. What does human reason tell us about gender? And there are many different